Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I interview Hoang Vu, a former Ph.D. student in the history department at Cornell University and a professor at Fulbright University in Vietnam, to talk about the international politics of the Mekong River in Southeast Asia from the mid-20th century to present day. Hoang, thank you for joining me on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Hi, Nakota. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for doing this podcast series to make research more accessible to general audience.
So you study a fairly complex topic, so I want to start by breaking down and defining certain aspects of your research. So most of my audience probably doesn't know that much about Southeast Asia. So can you first start by talking about what is the Mekong River? And you also talk about the Mekong Commission. So can you start by talking about what those two things are and sort of historicize it a little bit?
Oh, right. So this is my latest research. So the Mekong River is one of the four major rivers that define Southeast Asia. These rivers, they're not just large rivers, they are civilization-forming rivers. They're rivers where that had been cradles to major civilizations in the region. There are four rivers in Southeast Asia. One is the Red River, which was the cradle of the Vietnamese civilization in North Vietnam, which flows to Hanoi. One is the Chao Phraya River, which is the cradle of the Thai civilization, the Siamese, and then later the Thai. One is the Irrawaddy, which is the cradle of the Burmese civilization. And then the fourth one, which is actually the largest one of all, is actually the cradle of multiple civilizations. These previous three, they mainly, form just one civilization, but one country. But the Mekong flows through four Southeast Asian countries. Actually five, yeah, a little bit of Myanmar, a very small bit through Myanmar, and then mostly through Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. It's a particularly impressive river. It's the river where you get the most fish, like the greatest inland fishery in the world. Traditionally, it's the Mekong River. Huge catch. It's the lifeblood of Laos. It's on its banks, was formed the Great Khmer Empire that built Angkor Wat. And it's also, when it reaches the sea, it creates this, it divides itself into 9 branches. So in Vietnam, it's called the Nine Dragons Delta, or the Nine Dragons River, in the south. And it's at the northern end of this delta is where Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, where I'm now living and working. So it's the rice bowl of Vietnam and of the region. So I mean, massively incredibly important river. It's also one, because it flows through so many countries, it's got this incredible history as well. In 1957, the UN, what is called SCAP, so which is a UN part of the UN ECOSOC, which basically governs, which is an agency that helps with development issues in the at the time rapidly decolonizing world. Got together a few programs, and they wanted to just create some sort of commission that brings together the countries that share this river. And that was the birth of the Mekong Committee in 1957. And this was during the time of the Cold War. So in the first few decades, it got a lot of monetary and political support from the United States, which is involved in the war in Vietnam more and more until the escalation under President Lyndon Johnson in 1964-65. And Lyndon Johnson in particular was a big backer of this project. He was, he was a school teacher from Texas. He went to Teachers College. And before that, he was from a very poor family in the South. And he talks about remembering how during the era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brought all these different states along this Tennessee Valley together to bring about huge developmental dam building projects, bringing electricity to his kind of backwater part of southern of the American South for the first time. And he talked about how wonderful it was. And so the United States was really pushing for this sort of project as a sort of anti-communist, example of how development can work the capitalist way. But then, of course, in 1975, the communist countries actually won out in Southeast Asia. The United States was forced to withdraw in 73, and by 75 was completely withdrawn from the region. And then a series of conflicts after that between these communist countries, which I call the Third Indochina War, further exacerbated the situation where this Mekong Committee was unable to function normally and had to become something called the Interim Mekong Committee, where these countries that were, while they were fighting each other, still have to find some way to cooperate. And that was the status of the Mekong Committee as the Interim Mekong Committee between 1978 and 1995, until when all the conflicts were over in 1995, they renegotiated the treaty and created what we have today, the Mekong River Commission, which is the modern iteration of that. And it's still the major regional governing body of this international river. Yeah.
Mm. So to break it down into simplest terms for people listening, this is essentially a platform of cooperation between these Southeast Asian countries when it comes to focusing on, I'm assuming, resources in the river, traveling on the river, et cetera, correct?
Yeah, so the number of issues that are of great interest with the Mekong, as with any of these really major rivers like the Nile or the Euphrates and Tigris in the Middle East, this is one of those rivers that creates a floodplain. It floods. It's supposed to flood naturally, and it's the floods that bring all these fish, this abundance of fish to the rivers, that brings the abundance of silt from the Himalayan mountains, all the way, from the Tibetan plateau all the way down to build the Mekong Delta that forms southern Vietnam. So it's for a long time, flooding is something that people kind of had to live with and had to, wasn't a pleasant thing if you live on the river. And for a long time, governments dreamed of building great dams that would not only control these floods, but also generate massive amounts of electricity to power these countries, make them energy independent and even energy exporters, and really just jumpstart their development. But then more and more, we also realize that the impact of building such dams can also be greatly detrimental. They can create big changes in the geography. They can create huge reservoirs that require the evacuation, the forced evacuation of many people from their ancestral lands. They interfere with the migration of fish. They interfere with the flow of the silt down the Mekong, and that coupled with climate change is a big threat to the existence of the delta. Remember, the delta is really land that we borrow from the sea, and if we stop building up that land constantly, the sea will one day reclaim that area. So it's an issue where upstream countries and downstream countries, which we call the upper and lower riparian states. It's a pretty term, riparian. They have to kind of cooperate with each other, have to negotiate to make sure that the development strategies don't negatively affect one another. And ideas about this have changed a lot throughout these different decades as awareness of environmental impact has grown as well.
So speaking of dams, one aspect that factors prominently into your research is this discussion of tension between the Southeast Asian countries and China in regards to the Mekong River. Can you talk a little bit about what is that tension and what is its significance?
Yeah, so the big, I guess, debate these days is about the fact that the Mekong River Commission counts in its membership Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the lower riparian states, right? China and Myanmar, the upper riparian states, are observers. They are not bound by the rules of the Mekong River Commission. Now, the rules require that any project that has to be built, you have to do extensive studies of the environmental impact and of the impact on other countries. And other countries, they don't really get veto power, but they get right of consultation, right? So you can't proceed with building something without everyone kind of agreeing to what its specifications are. So one example is the most recently built major dam on the mainstream, the Saiyaburi Dam in Laos, which is actually like the largest one in the lower river, which was negotiated for over 10 years between these countries. And when it was built with like a lot of UN inspections. It's got like these special sluice gates so that the fish can migrate through, and it's supposed to allow silt as well to flow through and not just build up. So there are all these qualifications that if you're a part of the Mekong River Commission, you have to kind of abide by. Now, China being outside of that, but also being the upstream state, the state that gets the Mekong at the point where it's actually producing, where the water is flowing fastest down the Great Himalayas, if you imagine. China has a lot of incentive and very little requirement on it to actually consult with lower riparian countries about what it's building. And in fact, China's built a number of dams on the mainstream of the Mekong, which lower riparian countries fear could be used as a strategic bargaining chip, because China could theoretically just hold a lot of the Mekong's waters during the dry season, or it could release the waters during the flooding season. And there's very little oversight, control, or just any rights of lower riparian countries to have any sort of say in what China does with these upstream dams. So so that's certainly created some tensions recently, although Of course, it's a very complex issue because from the Chinese side, they say, number one, we don't divert any of the waters away from the Mekong. And in fact, the part of the Mekong in China only contributes about 14% of the total waters of the Mekong. Yeah, they say actually our impact is not that serious, and also we will communicate with you. We'll tell you when we are holding water, when we're releasing water. We actually can help you control floods. That's what they say. So, so really the big question now is, without any mechanism really to hold the Chinese to their words, right? And China, of course, does not want any sort of international controls on how it exercises its dams. You know, it can always be used in a negative way if things go south.
Yeah, and I wonder how this has factored into larger political discussions that are going on in the Vietnamese government or in any riparian state in general. And has this affected, or rather, has this caused any social tensions between the citizens of the riparian states and the citizens of China in any way? And if so, can you provide examples both on a political and social level of what those tensions look like, if there are any serious conversations going on in that regard?
Well, tensions between, well, or should I say, the public perception, right, of China as this giant next door that may not always have our best interests at heart is something that goes far beyond the Mekong for countries like Vietnam, to some extent Thailand, Laos, to some extent Cambodia as well, because of our long history living next to China. A lot of this history, of course, has been overblown by nationalism and ultra-nationalism, and this specter of the Chinese threat has sometimes been used for domestic political gain. But I would say just simply that there are many other reasons that citizens of some of these Southeast Asian countries have distrusted China. That's not just the Mekong issue is just one of these many different things. So for example, with Vietnam, the disputes in the South China Sea, both over the Spratly and Paracel Islands, it's another issue that really drives a lot of people's emotions, towards having a very anti-Chinese perception. In Thailand or especially in other parts of Southeast Asia, there's sometimes this perception of the Chinese as being the business elite in these countries, and there's some discrimination towards them. There's some kind of fearful reverence, almost in some ways, that they're very successful, but they also are sometimes not welcome in some of these countries. So the roots of anti-Chinese feelings kind of throughout Southeast Asia are very complex and nebulous. It's simply that the Mekong issue is now just and the building of these dams is really very recent in the last 20 years. This is just an additional layer, if you will, that adds on to what was already a pretty tense situation in some ways. That's not to say, I mean, for many of these countries, China is the number one or number two, biggest trading partner, right? I mean, it's not that the official relationship between these countries are bad. It's just that sometimes the public perception of China is just really not so good.
I want to pair the issue of tension between the riparian countries and China with discussions of climate change and environmental issues. And what those environmental impacts look like on, for example, farmers or natural areas of the riparian countries, and have these negative environmental changes called into question for these people the efficacy of the MRC? Do they see it as an effective organization? So there's two questions packed in there.
Yeah. Yeah. So right now, the Mekong River is certainly under a lot of threat. Actually, one of the more popular books that just came out recently, um, I'd say it's this one here by Brian Eiler, who's a Southeast Asia director at the Stimson Center. It's called "The Last Days of the Mighty Mekong." And, it's very, very dramatic language. Where he's kind of talking about all these ecological environmental threats. In terms of fisheries, we're seeing really the disappearance of, dolphins used to live in the Mekong, a very specific species of dolphins, of the Mekong dolphins, and they're pretty much gone. Because I mean, of various factors, but also in part because many of the fish, the prey are also gone. Traditionally, the way you would fish on the Mekong, and people have done this for many, many generations, is during the rainy season when there's so many fish migrating and such a great catch to be had. For generations, we've known, if you see the way the fishermen do it, they would wrap their nets around just half of the river. At a time when if they wanted to, they could put the net across the entire river and get a lot of fish. But traditionally, they knew not to do that, because half the fish just have to be able to just get through and breed and live their lives, and that's sustainability for you. But now you are seeing really the collapse of fisheries as the migration of these fish are starting to be disrupted. And I don't mean to blame China for all of it, right? It's just China's also not the only country building dams on the Mekong. The other countries too, some on the main on the main waterway, but others also on the tributaries as well of the Mekong. So fisheries is one issue. The sinking of the Mekong Delta. If you look at just about any map of projections of how the world will look in 2030, 2050 with climate change, 1 degree, 2 degree, 3 degree climate change, you're going to see pretty much even in the 1 degree maps that the Mekong Delta, just like just like Bangladesh or parts of the Everglades in Florida. I mean, these are just some of the most threatened places on Earth already because of climate change, because of rising sea levels. So if you imagine the decline of silt, of this life-giving, this land-giving silt coming down the Mekong, that's just coming at an especially bad time, and it contributes to a crisis that's already happening. And if the Mekong Delta itself disappears underwater, I mean, that's the home of something like 20 million people. So it's a serious issue for sure. You talked earlier about navigation as well up the Mekong. That's been a dream from the French era. That's how they discovered Angkor Wat, or they discovered that these French guys coming up there and discovered something that the Cambodians built. But okay, so but they were there looking for a way up to China, right? That's their dream. The British and the Americans have control of the coast, so how can we French get there? It's by trying to go up this river, and they realize that it's actually really, really hard. And today, I think the technology exists to make the Mekong fully navigable, and the proposals for it to be. up to, or at least up to a certain point. But and that could be very attractive to China. But in order to do this, you'll have to blast through some natural rock formations, and there are certainly some environmental concerns about doing that. So right now, that's something that's being considered as well.
I just had a couple more questions before we wrap up. One of which is thinking about the Mekong River Committee in a practical sense. What are some of the biggest takeaways of it that we can apply to other either domestic or international institutions? And that can be lessons of the successes of the MRC or the failures. What would you say are the one or two biggest takeaways that can be applied to other institutions?
Oh yeah, yeah. And Nakota, I also apologize. I feel like I also didn't answer the second part of your earlier question as
Oh,
well.
go
Also,
ahead, go ahead. You can take care of that.
yeah. No, but I think these two overlap. So really, my research, I'm actually a historian. I'm actually not. I mean, I am trained in political science as well. But my real, love is kind of political history, and I try to find places where political history can try to can actually help us get a new lens, a new way of looking at present day challenges and problems, such as the Mekong River Commission. So as these challenges are happening, we're seeing that the Mekong River Commission is not entirely powerless, but it's certainly it's slowly having to give way to the pressures of development, in a sense that it's not able to protect the environment quite. It can resist certain dam building efforts, but it can't stop them completely, because the language of it says that the countries have to continually consult and debate with each other about the building of these dams, but no one can actually veto the building of these dams indefinitely, right? So ultimately, you have to come to some sort of accommodation. And what I did is I look at the 1980s, this Interim Mekong Committee that I mentioned earlier, which is the time when most historians have kind of dismissed it as being I guess, like the best thing to come out of a worse situation where essentially the region was at war, and they felt that it was just a compromise that they had to put together, and this Interim Mekong Committee didn't achieve very much because everyone was kind of in conflict anyways. And I was looking back at the terms of, at the founding documents and the guiding principles of that organization, and I found something surprising. I found that actually it had much stronger protections for lower riparian states than the current MRC does. In fact, it allowed them veto power over any projects that's potentially damaging to other countries. And in fact, it was such strong protections. It seemed to many people like it was a failure, but because it didn't build as many things. But in fact, it's actually the stopping of the building of major dams that was its greatest legacy. And in fact, in the 1970s and early 1980s, there was this dream of building a mega dam on the Mekong. It would be called the Pamong Dam. And when it would be built, it would actually be, at that time, the largest dam by electric output, the most powerful dam in the world. And if it had been built today, it would be the second biggest dam in the world, only second to China's Three Gorges Dam. And we know what a huge environmental impact that one was. So the Interim Mekong Committee actually met and debated for a long time over the consequences of building such a dam. Would have displaced 80,000 people. And ultimately, in around 1983, 84, it decided to really revise the way that nations should build dams on the Mekong, and decide to build run-of-the-river dams instead that have much less environmental consequences. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the current mechanism certainly is weak in some ways. And in part, I'm trying to look at history to look at a situation where, in fact, right in this region, right, its predecessor, we actually had a stronger regime with stronger protections for the environment and for the rights of lower riparian states than we do now. And the other big takeaway from my research is that even though these countries were at war in the 1980s, or not officially at war, but really, I mean, their troops were clashing on the border and they really didn't like each other. They managed to still cooperate and build friendships across the aisle, across the river, if you will, between the people that worked on the Mekong River. And when I'm interviewing experts now, they're saying that back then, the Vietnamese experts, they felt that they could make friends with the Thais much more easily than they can with the Chinese today. Even though Vietnam and China today, actually, we share the same political system, the same one-party communist system, but they actually find that they can't connect with the Chinese side nearly as easily for various reasons. So that's certainly another major takeaway as to, you know, how important it is that cooperation was able to happen in the 1980s, where even if governments didn't like each other, people could connect. But somehow today, because of language barriers, because of some of them complain about attitudes of people that attend these conferences being haughty or being distant, not being that friendly, one way or another, that's not happening. And I think that's really important for us to think about ways to build these interpersonal relationships and connections to bridge our differences across the Mekong.
So I know you'd already brought up a book that speaks to part of your thesis, but one question that I like to ask all of my interviewees is if someone is interested in this topic that we're discussing, if they want to know more about the Mekong River or just the politics of the riparian states in Southeast Asia, what would be one or two books that you would recommend someone listening to this episode?
Well, there haven't been that many deep, like book-length studies of the Mekong River, weirdly enough. Actually, I would definitely recommend Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, but even it doesn't go deeply into the politics of it. Actually, a lot of it is actually like research papers. That's a really good question. Yeah, I really have to figure out why it is that we haven't had like proper volumes, you know, talking about the Mekong River Commission and its strengths and weaknesses. I can recommend you like, you know, 10 research papers, but yeah, book, man. But this is a good book. This is a good book. Yeah.
Okay, well, it's at least one book on the table for anyone who's interested in knowing more about this part of the world. But anyway, Hoang, thank you for joining us on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nakota. Thanks for having me. And yeah, if any of your listeners are interested to know more and or want to talk more about some of these issues, I mean, this is my ongoing research. It's building forward from my dissertation research, but it's completely separate as well. So I'm always happy to hear feedback and you know, to have discussions with anyone who is interested in this issue.
And for those who are interested in watching more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or nakotadefonso.com. We'll see you in the next episode.